What's good, everybody? Ani Singh here. In today's video, I'm going to go into Ukraine war deep dive and explain what really happened. Get the perspective from both sides. What the media doesn't want to do, that's an assumption, This is going to be an introduction to the war, basically. Most of you guys do know, but you guys don't really know what's going on. So I'm just going to give a quick introduction to the war, get your guys' minds refreshed. Basically, Russia claimed the West and NATO was using Ukraine to threaten Russia. In early 2021, the Russian military began massing on Ukrainian borders. On June 2021 Brussels summit, NATO leaders reiterated the decision taken at the 2008 Bucharest summit that Ukraine would eventually join NATO. This is a big no-no for Russia. In late 2021, there was another massive Russian military buildup right after the Brussels summit where NATO leaders said Ukraine was going to join NATO. The Russian Foreign Ministry demanded that Ukraine be forbidden from ever joining NATO. Then, the NATO Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, replied that a decision is up to Ukraine and NATO members, adding Russia has no right to establish a sphere of influence to try to control their neighbors. Then, Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022. After Russia's President Vladimir Putin falsely claimed NATO was using Ukraine to threaten Russia. This is falsely, according to Wikipedia. Ukraine applied for NATO membership in September 2022 after Russia proclaimed that it had annexed the country's southeast. This war could have easily been avoided if NATO just said, okay, Ukrainian can't get NATO membership. Thousands upon thousands of lives would have been saved. This is the death toll and injury toll in total for the war, 500,000. This could have been avoided so easily. Now I'm going to give you guys a background of the war. This is the background of the war, because you guys got to understand the history. What happened before the war? How does this happen? What countries were playing a role? You got to understand that to know what's really going on. If you look at NATO's growth since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, it has been all towards Russia. The Russia border by Europe is covered in NATO allied countries except for two countries, Ukraine and Georgia. NATO agreed that it wouldn't expand 1 inch eastward, and it did 5 times in 5 ways after that. NATO agreed after the Soviet Union collapsed in around 1991, around there, the secretary at the time had a word-to-word agreement with the Russian leader at the time saying we will not expand 1 inch eastward. Post-Soviet Union Russia tried to make allies with the USA, but every time the USA declined. This is off the Tucker Carlson Putin interview. Putin said this in the interview. Putin tried to make allies with USA multiple times, and they declined. Putin asked Bill Clinton in the year 2000 to join NATO. He said no. This is off the Tucker Carlson podcast with Vladimir Putin. This is Putin's own words. Ukraine was a neutral state then. So Ukraine was a neutral state. It was neutral. It was not, leading to the one side or the other. Ukraine stated that it was a neutral state. NATO opened its door to Ukraine and Georgia shortly after he stated that. In 2008, NATO opened its door to Ukraine and Georgia in 2008. Putin warned that their membership would be a threat to Russia. Putin and Russia have all been saying this. It's a repeated theme now that please respect us. We don't want Georgia or Ukraine to join NATO. Please don't do this. If you guys do this, please don't. We have to take the next step. Please don't do this. We have to protect our borders if Ukraine and Georgia join NATO. Putin is warning them multiple times. This is back in 2008. The Kremlin advisor Sergei Glasev warned in September 2013 that if Ukraine signed the EU agreement, Russia would no longer acknowledge Ukraine's border. In November, Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych suddenly withdrew from signing the agreement. So he didn't sign the agreement. This is then President Viktor Yanukovych. He didn't sign the agreement. Everything was fine. Ukraine and Russia were good. Guess what happened in 2014? A far-right coup in Kiev, which overthrew the pro-Russian president Viktor Yanukovych. There was a coup d'etat. Who Putin alleged this coup d'etat was the CIA, the West, Europe, because who they put in his place, he was replaced by Alexander Turchinov, a far-right president, practically a U.S. elected president. Those last words were in Putin's words via the Tucker Carlson podcast. This coup d'etat was openly backed by USA and Europe. It was openly backed. You guys can search it up. The coup d'etat then sparked a civil war. It was Russian-backed separatists versus U.S.-backed Ukrainians. With the annexation of Crimea, the Ukrainian parliament requested membership for NATO, but it didn't fit the guidelines yet. Russia demanded that NATO end all activity in Eastern Europe and ban Ukraine or any other former Soviet state from ever joining NATO. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg replied that Russia has no say on whether Ukraine joins and that Russia has no right to establish a sphere of influence to try to control their neighbors. February 21, now we're getting to the war of 2022. Russia invaded Ukraine on the basis that it had to take back the historical lands of Russia and that Ukraine was under control of the West. This is in Putin's words. But, I mean, we do send our hundreds of billions of dollars to Ukraine, and NATO does too, so we are enablers in that sort, so I can see why Putin says that, but, you know, that's for another video. Let's get into the current state of the war now. Putin said in the Tucker Carlson interview, this war can be stopped when America stops supplying weaponry to Ukraine. That's what Putin said. And then he said we could talk about peace settlements. Biden said at the debate, you guys can look this up, look at the debate. What happened, this is not his exact words, this is not what he exactly said, but this is kind of the premise of his message. Biden said at the debate, what happens when Putin gets to Ukraine? Then he go on Poland and so on and so on. He's hinting that what happens when Putin gets Ukraine? Then he's gonna go want to get Poland. Then he's gonna go take over Europe. That's just idiocracy, bro. Putin is not gonna do that. If you believe that, I'm sorry, but you're naive, bro. Tucker Carlson then asked Putin in the interview, do you see an instance where you send Russian troops to Poland? Putin said only if Poland attacks Russia, that's reasonable. If Mexico attacked the USA, we obviously will send troops down there. Putin said the United States controls the United States media and many European media. That's interesting. That's interesting. That's really interesting because he said that in the Tucker Carlson podcast. That's really interesting. Because the media is always bashing Putin. They're never showing this side of the story, the side that I just explained. They're never showing this. They will never show you guys this, but you know, I am. This is how the war is going to end. When the West stops supplying and enabling this war, that's just the hard cold facts. We are enabling this war, enabling hundreds of thousands of people to die, enabling death. Yes, we're giving them billions of dollars in weapons. What else do you need for a war? We're basically giving them the tools to kill. Even Putin said this himself. The war will stop when the West stops supplying Ukraine with funds and ammunition. This war is really stupid if you really think about it. This can be easily avoided. This is my interpretation of the war. It's a U.S.-NATO war. That's what I basically think it is. It's a U.S.-NATO war versus Russia. I'm going to say it again. I think this is a U.S.-NATO war against Russia. That's what I really think it is. Because without U.S. and NATO, there would be no war in Ukraine right now. There would be no war in Ukraine. Without the U.S. and NATO in the West, there would be no war in Ukraine. That's why I think this is a U.S.-NATO war. But they're sending Ukrainians out there to die over NATO membership to Ukraine and membership invite to Ukraine and 4 cities in Ukraine that Putin wants. This is how it can be easily avoided. If you really think about it, Putin has a right to be mad with NATO. They made an agreement back in the 1990s. The NATO leader, whatever it is, the NATO leader had an agreement, verbal agreement with the then Russia leader, said we will not expand 1 inch eastward. They did so 5 times in 5 ways of transformation. Putin continuously said, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. We don't feel comfortable. Respect our borders. Don't do this. And they went all the way up to Russia's border. Russia's west border is completely covered in NATO states except for Georgia and Ukraine. Imagine if China and Russia went to Mexico, started making alliances with all the cities around the Texas border. What would the U.S. do? We would obviously make the first move, and that's basically what's happening in Russia. NATO is covering his border. He has a right to be mad, bro. He has a right to be mad. But yeah, that was my interpretation of the war. I hope you guys enjoyed. That was a video. Have a good day.